Plantation records from northeastern Alabama reveal an entry dated March 1856 that defies explanation. 12 men, armed, trained, and authorized by law failed to restrain a single individual. Buried in county archives for over a century, the incident report describes wounds that shouldn't have been survivable. A display of resistance that medical experts of the era deemed physiologically impossible, and an aftermath so disturbing that 3 overseers resigned within days. 2 never speaking of what they witnessed. The plantation owner ordered all documentation sealed, paying families substantial sums for their silence. What actually happened on the Harrington estate that spring morning wasn't supernatural. It was something far more terrifying. A truth about human capability that threatened the entire foundation of Southern society. Before we continue with the story of Jacob Terrell and the morning that changed Harrington Plantation forever, if you're fascinated by dark historical mysteries that blur the line between documented fact and impossible legend, subscribe to this channel and comment below what state you're watching from. We love hearing where our community discovers these forgotten American stories. The incident at Harrington Plantation didn't emerge from nowhere. To understand what transpired, you must first understand the men, the place, and the carefully constructed system that both created and feared him. Sprawling across 3,000 acres of Alabama bottomland, Harrington Plantation lay where the Tallapoosa River carved through red clay hills thick with oak and pine. Established in 1821 by Colonel Marcus Harrington, a veteran of the Creek War, the estate had grown into one of Madison County's most profitable cotton operations. By 1856, it sustained 240 enslaved individuals, produced 1,500 bales annually, and employed 17 white overseers, an unusually high number that locals attributed to Colonel Harrington's meticulous management style. On a rise overlooking the field stood the plantation house, a Greek Revival mansion with 16 rooms and galleries on 3 sides. But the true heart of the operation lay in the quarters. 2 long rows of cabins, the cotton gin, the mill, the smokehouse, and the disciplinary structure that kept the entire system functioning. With mathematical precision, Colonel Harrington ran his plantation, keeping detailed records of every bushel picked, every hour worked, every punishment administered. In the autumn of 1852, Jacob Terrell arrived at Harrington Plantation. Purchased at a Richmond auction for the staggering sum of $2,000, nearly triple the average price. Still preserved in Virginia Historical Archives, the auction house documents describe him as approximately 28 years of age, 6 feet 7 inches in height, 260 pounds, remarkable physical constitution, previous employment in iron foundry work and timber operations, no history of resistance or difficulty. What the documents didn't mention was that Jacob had spent his entire life in industrial labor rather than agricultural work. Born on an iron plantation in the Shenandoah Valley, he'd worked the furnaces and forges from age 12, developing not the lean endurance of field hands, but the dense compact strength of industrial laborers. Not for discipline problems, but for economic reasons, his previous owner, a furnace master named Hiram Lell, had sold him. The Panic of 1851 had devastated Virginia's iron industry, forcing operations to liquidate assets. Specifically for the most demanding physical tasks on the plantation, Colonel Harrington bought Jacob, clearing new land, operating the cotton press, managing the heaviest equipment. For nearly 4 years, Jacob performed these duties without incident. He spoke little, worked efficiently, and drew no particular attention from overseers or other enslaved people. But something changed in the winter of 1855. The plantation's head cook, Martha Clemens, one of the few enslaved people allowed near the main house, later told her granddaughter, who preserved the account in a Works Progress Administration interview in 1937, that Jacob had received news that autumn. Somehow a letter had reached him, though enslaved people were forbidden from receiving correspondence. The letter's contents were never confirmed, but Martha recalled seeing Jacob standing motionless behind the cookhouse one October evening, a piece of paper in his hands, his face transformed by an expression she described as like watching a man realize he's already dead. From that point forward, subtle changes manifested in Jacob's demeanor. He continued working with the same efficiency, but overseers reported an unsettling quality to his compliance, a mechanical precision that felt more like counting down than cooperating. In his daily log, Thomas Gibbard, the head overseer, noted that Jacob had begun asking unusual questions about property boundaries, river depths, and distances to neighboring counties. Nothing overtly suspicious, but enough to raise vigilance. The other enslaved people began treating Jacob differently as well. Some avoided him entirely. Others sought his presence during evening gatherings, as if proximity to him provided some undefined reassurance. Old Samuel, who'd lived at Harrington longer than anyone, told Martha that Jacob reminded him of something he'd witnessed once during a storm. The peculiar stillness before the sky turned green and the tornado came. Despite his reputation for attentiveness, Colonel Harrington seemed not to notice these subtle shifts. That winter, his attention focused primarily on his eldest daughter, Caroline's upcoming marriage to a Charleston merchant, an alliance that would significantly expand his commercial connections. Planned for late March 1856, the wedding would have guests expected from across the South. The plantation needed to present its most impressive face. In February, the colonel ordered an expansion of the cotton press operation, requiring additional cleared land and new equipment installation. Jacob was assigned to lead this project, working alongside 8 other men under the direct supervision of 3 overseers: Gibbard, a Kentuckyman named Eli Strauss, and a recent hire from Georgia, William Pritchard. Steadily through February and into early March, the work progressed. But on March 14th, exactly 1 week before Caroline's wedding, everything changed. The morning of March 14, 1856, began unremarkably. Dawn arrived wrapped in thick fog from the Tallapoosa River, the kind that turned the plantation into a landscape of gray shapes and muffled sounds. Near 40 degrees the temperature hovered, cold enough that breath showed white, but not cold enough to delay work. At 5:30 a.m., as it did every morning, the plantation bell rang, calling everyone to their assignments. As required, Jacob reported to the cotton press area, joining the work crew preparing timber for the new press foundation. Thomas Gibbard was there along with Eli Strauss and William Pritchard. Their standard equipment was carried by the 3 overseers: coiled leather straps, wooden bats, and Gibbard's pistol, which he wore prominently on his belt. According to multiple testimonies compiled afterward, the trouble began around 7:15 a.m., though accounts differ on the specific trigger. GR's official report states that Jacob refused a direct order to move a beam, displaying open insubordination. Jacob spoke disrespectfully when corrected for slow work, claims Eli Strauss's written statement, but Martha Clemens, who was collecting water from the nearby well, heard something else entirely. She later told her granddaughter that she'd heard Gibbard announce that a letter had been intercepted, that its sender had been dealt with according to law, and that Jacob needed to understand the consequences of unauthorized correspondence. Whatever the actual catalyst, what happened next was witnessed by at least a dozen people and documented in incident reports so disturbing that Colonel Harrington initially refused to file them with county authorities. With the leather strap, Gibbard approached Jacob, standard procedure for even minor infractions. Jacob, who'd never previously resisted any form of punishment, didn't move. Gibbard ordered him to prepare himself. Motionless, Jacob remained, his eyes fixed on something in the distance, the direction of the river. Some witnesses later said, though from that position, the river wasn't visible through the fog. Across the shoulders, Gibbard struck him. Jacob didn't flinch. To force compliance, Eli Strauss moved to assist, grabbing Jacob's arm. What happened then confused everyone present. Strauss later testified that grabbing Jacob's arm felt like gripping an oak beam. Jacob didn't pull away or struggle. He simply remained immobile while Strauss attempted to move him as if the normal mechanics of human leverage had ceased to function. William Pritchard joined the effort. 3 overseers, all larger than average men, accustomed to physical confrontation, attempting to move one person who was offering no active resistance, merely standing still and failing completely. His authority challenged before the entire work crew, Gibbard fired his pistol into the air and shouted for additional help. Running from nearby areas, the shot brought 4 more overseers. Beginning to lift, the fog revealed the scene to an expanding audience of enslaved workers who'd stopped what they were doing to watch. 7 overseers surrounded Jacob. Gibbard issued a clear order: restrain him and deliver punishment for insubordination. Simultaneously, the men moved in. What transpired over the next several minutes would be described in remarkably consistent terms by multiple witnesses, though none could adequately explain the mechanics of what they observed. Using standard techniques, leverage, joint manipulation, overwhelming force, the overseers attempted to force Jacob to the ground. In any conventional sense, Jacob didn't fight back. He didn't throw punches or kicks. He didn't grab or push. He simply wouldn't go down. Witnesses described it as watching men trying to topple a tree that had decided not to fall. No result was produced by every technique that should have worked, that always worked. Jacob's knees didn't buckle. His balance didn't break. When gripped, his arms couldn't be manipulated into submission holds. Completely now, the fog had burned off. In full daylight before dozens of witnesses, the scene was occurring. Desperate, Gibbard sent a runner to fetch every available overseer on the plantation. Within 10 minutes, 12 men had assembled, the largest concentration of authority figures most enslaved people on Harrington had ever seen in one place. Against one unarmed man who still had not struck a single blow or made any aggressive movement, 12 armed overseers. Summoned, Colonel Harrington himself was approaching from the main house, his face dark with fury at this disruption so close to his daughter's wedding. The 12 overseers coordinated their approach. This wasn't an act of punishment anymore. It had become a demonstration of power, a reassertion of the fundamental order that governed plantation society. If one man could resist 12, the entire system faced an existential question. From all sides, they rushed Jacob simultaneously. The sounds that followed, this detail appears in every written testimony, were wrong. Not the sounds of fighting, but of impact. Bone against bone. With percussive force, bodies hitting the ground. Grunts of pain and shock. But these sounds came from the overseers, not from Jacob. When Colonel Harrington arrived at the scene, 4 overseers lay on the ground injured. Thomas Gibbard had a dislocated shoulder. Eli Strauss's jaw was broken. Unconscious with a head wound was William Pritchard. A 4th man had suffered broken ribs. Forming a circle around Jacob, the remaining 8 overseers had pulled back, who stood in the center of the cleared space, breathing heavily, but showing no other signs of the confrontation. The critical detail that appears in every account, Jacob hadn't thrown a single punch. The injuries had resulted from the overseer's own force being redirected, from collisions with each other, from failed takedown attempts that sent them sprawling. Several witnesses described it as watching men injure themselves against a wall that could think. His own pistol, Colonel Harrington drew. For a long moment, the clearing went silent. Perhaps 30 seconds, witnesses estimated, though fear distorts time. Jacob and the colonel stared at each other. In that extended pause, something unspoken but clearly understood passed between them. On the trigger, the colonel's finger remained. Motionless, Jacob remained, his expression unreadable. Then Jacob spoke, his voice carrying across the silent clearing with perfect clarity. Witnesses agreed on his words, though they disagreed on his tone. Some said it was flat and empty. Others said it held profound sorrow, and a few insisted it conveyed something close to pity. "I ain't here no more," Jacob said. "You might be looking at me, but I ain't here. Since that letter came, I've been gone." He turned then, not hurriedly, but with calm deliberation, and walked toward the tree-line. The colonel shouted for the overseers to stop him. None moved. Into the woods bordering the plantation's northeastern boundary, Jacob disappeared. By then, the fog had fully lifted. The morning was bright and clear, and Jacob Terrell, who 12 armed men had failed to restrain, was gone. Confusion that bordered on hysteria was created by the immediate aftermath of Jacob's departure. An immediate lockdown of the entire plantation was ordered by Colonel Harrington. No one was permitted to leave their designated areas. Despite their injuries, the 12 overseers were dispatched in pairs to search the woods and surrounding properties. With descriptions and warnings, riders were sent to neighboring plantations. The Madison County Sheriff was notified, and within hours, a formal pursuit had been organized involving 23 men and dogs borrowed from a plantation 15 miles south. But with a thoroughness that seemed impossible given the resources dedicated to finding him, Jacob Terrell had vanished. From the cotton press area, the tracking dogs picked up his scent easily enough, followed it into the woods for perhaps half a mile, then abruptly lost it at the edge of a creek. This wasn't unusual. Water disrupts scent trails. What puzzled the trackers was that they couldn't pick up the trail on either bank, upstream or downstream, despite searching for 3 miles in both directions. It was as if Jacob had stepped into the water and ceased to exist. For 11 days, the search continued. Every known hiding place was checked by patrols, every cave, every abandoned structure within a 20-mile radius. They questioned enslaved people on neighboring plantations, offering rewards for information. They monitored roads, river crossings, and known routes toward free states. They found nothing. During those 11 days, the atmosphere at Harrington Plantation transformed. When questioned by authorities, the enslaved community, which had witnessed the confrontation, maintained absolute silence about Jacob's departure. But among themselves, according to accounts preserved decades later, they spoke of little else. Some expressed hope that Jacob had found freedom. Others feared terrible retribution when he was inevitably captured. A few shared rumors that Jacob had never intended to run at all, that he'd walked into those woods to die on his own terms, having finally broken under some unbearable psychological weight. As scheduled, the wedding proceeded on March 21st, though Colonel Harrington's demeanor during the festivities struck guests as distracted and tense. Due to their wounds, 3 of the injured overseers were unable to attend. Servants later recalled the celebration felt forced, as if everyone present was pretending not to notice the question hanging over the plantation. How had one man resisted 12? And what did it mean that he'd succeeded? On March 23, Thomas Gibbard, his shoulder still bound after the dislocation, submitted his resignation. Preserved in the plantation papers, in his letter to Colonel Harrington, he wrote, "I can no longer in good conscience maintain discipline on this property. What I witnessed on March 14 has led me to conclude that the foundations of our system contain flaws I had not previously recognized. I respectfully request immediate release from my duties." 2 days later, Eli Strauss resigned. His letter was shorter. "I cannot explain what happened. I will not try. I am going back to Kentucky." William Pritchard, who'd been unconscious during the critical moments, remained at the plantation, but began drinking heavily. Other enslaved people reported seeing him standing alone near the cotton press area at odd hours, staring into the woods where Jacob had disappeared, his expression haunted. Initially, Colonel Harrington refused to discuss the incident. When forced to provide information to county authorities, he submitted a minimal report describing Jacob as an escaped slave who exhibited unusual resistance to lawful restraint. He made no mention of the 12 overseers, the injuries, or the specific circumstances of the confrontation. The report listed Jacob's physical description, estimated value, and offered a standard $50 reward for his capture and return. But privately, the colonel began conducting his own investigation. He questioned everyone who'd known Jacob, trying to understand what he'd missed. He reviewed purchase records, work logs, any documentation that might explain what had transformed a supposedly compliant worker into someone capable of the March 14 resistance. His inquiries led him to the letter, the correspondence that Martha Clemens had mentioned that Gibbard had allegedly referenced during the confrontation. The colonel discovered that the plantation's mail, which was routinely inspected, had indeed intercepted a letter addressed to Jacob in February. The letter had been confiscated and destroyed before Jacob could receive it. Standard procedure for unauthorized correspondence. But the colonel's review of the mail logs revealed something disturbing. The letter hadn't been destroyed immediately. One of the overseers, a man named Henry Wallace, who'd resigned in January for unstated reasons, had kept it for several days before turning it in. During those days, Wallace had apparently shown it to at least 3 other overseers, and one of them had likely mentioned it to Jacob, perhaps as a form of psychological control, perhaps as simple cruelty. In early April, the colonel tracked down Henry Wallace and questioned him about the letter's contents. Wallace, now working as a supervisor at a textile mill in Huntsville, was reluctant to discuss it. When pressed, he finally admitted that the letter had come from Virginia from a woman identifying herself as Jacob's wife. The letter, Wallace recalled, had been brief and devastating. After her owner's death, Jacob's wife had been sold south. She'd written from a plantation in Georgia, having somehow gotten word to Jacob about her location. The letter contained a plea for Jacob not to attempt rescue, an acknowledgement that they would never see each other again, and a final message. She was pregnant with their child, conceived during Jacob's last visit to Virginia before his own sail south. Wallace told the colonel that the letter's final lines had stayed with him. "Don't let them take you piece by piece. Whatever they do to the body don't matter if you keep yourself whole inside. Remember me. Remember we real." The colonel asked why Wallace had resigned. Wallace's response, documented in the colonel's private journal, was unsettling. "After I read that letter, I couldn't look at any of them the same. I kept thinking about what it means to own a man who loves somebody. It started keeping me awake." Armed with this information, Colonel Harrington reassessed the March 14th incident. Jacob's resistance hadn't been random defiance or sudden madness. It had been a deliberate choice made by a man who'd lost everything that made compliance bearable. The "I ain't here no more" statement took on new meaning. Psychologically, Jacob had severed himself from the circumstances of his enslavement, rendering physical coercion meaningless because he no longer valued his own physical preservation. More than the escape itself, this realization disturbed the colonel. The system he'd maintained so carefully depended on enslaved people having something to lose: comfort, relationships, hope of better conditions. A man who'd abandoned all hope, who decided his physical body was no longer his concern, couldn't be controlled by conventional means. On April 12, nearly a month after the incident, a plantation hand discovered something near the northeastern property line in the same general area where Jacob had entered the woods. It was a small cloth bundle carefully wrapped and wedged into the hollow of an oak tree about 30 yards from where the dogs had lost Jacob's scent. Inside the bundle were 3 items. A small wooden carving of 2 figures holding hands, simple but carefully crafted. A scrap of paper with an address in Georgia written in careful letters. And a piece of metal that appeared to be a tag from an iron foundry, the kind worn by industrial workers to identify their specialized skills. But what disturbed those who examined the bundle was the accompanying note written on a torn piece of what appeared to be the intercepted letter. The handwriting was crude but legible. "I ain't running, I'm walking slow and steady. Am going to Georgia. Probably take me 4 months if I move careful. If I make it, you won't never hear of me again. If I don't make it, at least I died trying to get back to what matters. That morning at the press, I wasn't fighting nobody. I was just showing y'all that I ain't a thing you can move around no more. I'm a man deciding where he goes. You can kill a man like that, but you can't work him. Colonel Harrington, you reading this, I want you to know I ain't got no hate for you. You built your life on top of a lie you was told was true. And I feel sorry for you having to live with that. The real curse ain't on us. It's on y'all. You the ones got to wake up every day knowing what you doing ain't right and doing it anyway. That eats at a man worse than any whip." The note was unsigned, but unquestionably in Jacob's hand. Based on comparison with the few documents where he'd marked his ex, Colonel Harrington ordered the note destroyed and the bundle burned. But word of its contents spread anyway, passed whisper by whisper through the enslaved community and eventually reaching some of the overseers. The note's message, that Jacob hadn't been fighting, but demonstrating that he was no longer available to be coerced, reframed the entire confrontation in ways that made several overseers deeply uncomfortable. As spring moved into summer, the colonel made a decision. He quietly discontinued any active search for Jacob. The official position was that after more than 2 months, the chances of recovery were negligible and further expenditure unjustified. But privately, the colonel confided to his brother-in-law that he hoped Jacob had died in the woods or been killed attempting to reach Georgia. Because the alternative, that Jacob had successfully completed a 350-mile journey through hostile territory, raised questions he didn't want answered. The alternative meant that determination and strategic thinking could overcome systems designed to prevent exactly that. It meant that compliance was a choice that could be withdrawn. It meant that the whole apparatus of control was more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. With no word of Jacob Terrell, summer turned to autumn. The Harrington plantation returned to its routines, though subtle changes remained. The colonel hired 2 additional overseers, bringing the total to 19, but both resigned within months, finding the atmosphere at the plantation unsettling in ways they couldn't articulate. Several enslaved people who'd witnessed the March confrontation developed reputations as quietly uncooperative, not openly resistant, but working with an efficiency that felt more like calculated minimum effort than genuine submission. Until the colonel had no choice but to dismiss him in November, William Pritchard's drinking worsened. Before leaving, Pritchard told Martha Clemens something she'd remember for decades. "I keep dreaming about that morning. Not about Jacob walking away, about the moment before the 12 of us rushed him. The way he looked at us, like he was already somewhere else and we was the ones who wasn't real no more." Then in January 1857, 9 months after Jacob's disappearance, a letter arrived at Harrington Plantation. It bore a Georgia postmark and was addressed to the owner of Harrington Estate, Madison County, Alabama. For 3 days, the letter from Georgia sat unopened on Colonel Harrington's desk. He'd recognized the handwriting anywhere. It matched the note found in the tree hollow, and more disturbingly, it bore the same distinctive mark Jacob used to sign documents, a simple X with a small circle at its center, a mark he'd apparently developed working at the iron foundry to distinguish his signature from others who couldn't write. When the colonel finally opened it on January 19, 1857, the contents were brief. "Colonel Harrington, I made it. Took me until October, but I made it. I am writing to tell you 3 things. First, I ain't your property no more, and I ain't running. I am with my wife and my son who was born in August. We are together, and that is all I wanted. Second, I want you to know that I held no anger that morning in March. You was doing what you thought was right based on what you was taught, but that don't make it right. Third, I'm sending this letter because I want you to understand something important. Every single person you own is making the same choice I made every single day. They are choosing to stay or choosing they ain't strong enough yet to leave or choosing they got reasons that matter more than freedom right now. But they are choosing. You don't own nobody, Colonel. You just got a system that makes it hard for people to choose different. But hard ain't the same as impossible. I prove that. This letter is my way of saying that everything you think is solid ain't solid at all. I hope you think about that. I hope it bothers you." Beyond the X and circle mark, the letter wasn't signed. Witnesses later reported Colonel Harrington's hands were shaking when he finished reading. He immediately summoned Thomas Gibbard, who'd reluctantly returned to the plantation in November after failing to find other work. The colonel showed him the letter and asked a single question. "Is this real? Could he actually have made it?" For a long moment, Gibbard studied the letter. 350 miles through Mississippi and Alabama into Georgia, he finally said, avoiding patrols, slave catchers, river crossings, winter coming on, no resources, no help, no maps. It shouldn't be possible. But the colonel pressed. "But Jacob Terrell did things that shouldn't have been possible on March 14, Gibbard said quietly. "Maybe impossible is different than we thought." To the Georgia plantation mentioned in Jacob's original letter bundle, the address where his wife had been sold, the colonel sent an inquiry. 6 weeks later, the response came. Yes. An enslaved woman matching the description had been on their property. Yes, she'd had a son in August, and yes, she'd escaped in late October with her infant, disappearing in the same frustratingly complete manner as Jacob. The Georgia overseer who wrote the response added an interesting detail. "On the night before the woman's escape, one of our patrols reported seeing an unusually large man near the property's northern boundary. When they approached to investigate, the figure retreated into the woods. They pursued but lost him within minutes, which struck us as strange given the clear moonlight and open terrain. The next morning, the woman and infant were gone. We assumed the large man was an accomplice, possibly a freedman from a nearby town who'd been hired to assist. But now, receiving your inquiry, I wonder if we witnessed something else entirely." Like wildfire, this news spread through Harrington Plantation, though the colonel tried to suppress it. With complex emotions, the enslaved community received it, joy at Jacob's success, fear of increased surveillance, and something else that concerned the overseers, a visible shift in how people carried themselves. Not open defiance, but a subtle straightening of shoulders, a fractional decrease in submission. Martha Clemens later described it to her granddaughter. After word got around about Jacob and his wife, people started walking different. Not loud different, quiet, different, like they remembered something they'd forgot. Increasingly paranoid, the colonel ordered additional security measures, more frequent cabin inspections, tighter control over movement between quarters, prohibition on gatherings of more than 4 people. Specifically to patrol the property boundaries at night, he hired 3 new overseers. But exactly what they were meant to prevent was created by these measures: more resentment, more quiet resistance, more people making the same calculation Jacob had made about what could be endured versus what could be attempted. In April 1857, 2 more people escaped from Harrington Plantation. Neither was captured. The colonel blamed lax security and fired 1 overseer as an example. In June, 3 more disappeared in a single night. Again, no trace was found. This wasn't normal. Plantation escapes were common enough, but successful escapes, people who truly vanished without being recovered within days or weeks, were rare. 6 people in 3 months, all disappearing as completely as Jacob had, suggested something organized, something the colonel couldn't identify or counter. In July, Thomas Gibbard approached the colonel with an unsettling observation. He'd been comparing the escape dates with moon phases and had noticed a pattern. Every escape occurred during the new moon when darkness was most complete. Furthermore, all 6 people who'd escaped had been present during the March 14th confrontation with Jacob. They'd watched him resist 12 overseers and walk away. They'd seen that impossible was different than they'd thought. "Jacob's not here," Gibbard told the colonel. "But what he did is still here." It changed something. People saw a different possibility and now they can't unsee it. Desperate to reassert control, the colonel made a decision that would haunt him for years. He ordered a public punishment of someone he suspected of facilitating the escapes, a man named Daniel Hayes, who'd been friends with several of those who disappeared. The punishment was calculated to be severe enough to serve as warning: 30 lashes administered in front of the entire enslaved community. The punishment was scheduled for July 28, 1857. As the assembled crowd watched Daniel Hayes being tied to the post, something unprecedented happened. Before the first lash could fall, a woman stepped forward. Then another, then a man. Within 30 seconds, more than 50 people had moved forward, forming a silent line between Daniel Hayes and the overseer holding the whip. They didn't speak. They didn't threaten. They didn't charge or attack. They simply stood there, present and refusing to move, creating a human barrier that couldn't be bypassed without violence that would injure dozens of people. The overseer looked to the colonel, who'd gone pale. The colonel ordered the crowd to disperse. No one moved. For 5 minutes, multiple witnesses timed it, nothing happened. The 2 groups stood facing each other in silence, neither willing to escalate, neither willing to back down. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the line of enslaved people, someone began humming. The tune was simple, repetitive, one that several people recognized from work songs. Within moments, others joined. Not loudly, not defiantly, just a steady, continuous hum that filled the silence with sound that somehow felt more unnerving than shouting would have been. Recognizing that actually dispersing this group would require violence that might spiral out of control, the colonel made a rare concession. He ordered Daniel Hayes released and the punishment postponed, pending further investigation. As the crowd dispersed, the colonel noticed something that chilled him more than the confrontation itself. Several people were smiling, not openly, not mockingly, but with small private expressions of satisfaction. They just demonstrated the same principle Jacob had shown on March 14th. Unified passive resistance, even from unarmed people, created situations that force couldn't easily resolve. The summer of 1857 transformed Harrington Plantation into something unrecognizable from what it had been 15 months earlier. Attempting to maintain control, the colonel oscillated between harsh crackdowns and nervous concessions, creating an atmosphere of unpredictable tension that satisfied no one and disturbed everyone. Between August and October, 4 more overseers resigned, all citing similar reasons in their departure letters: an inability to maintain discipline through traditional means, a sense that the fundamental dynamics of the plantation had shifted in ways they couldn't manage, and most tellingly, a growing discomfort with their own role in the system. One overseer, a man named Patrick Doyle from South Carolina, wrote in his resignation, "I came to Alabama believing I understood the nature of this business. The events of the past year have demonstrated I understood nothing. When 50 people can stop a lawful punishment simply by standing still. When 6 people can disappear as completely as if the earth swallowed them. When stories about one man's resistance can change how hundreds of others think about their circumstances, then the entire operation rests on foundations more fragile than any of us wanted to admit. I no longer have confidence that these foundations can hold, and I don't wish to be present when they crack. Meanwhile, the enslaved community at Harrington was experiencing its own complex transformation. Powerful had been the solidarity demonstrated during the Daniel Hayes incident, but it had also been dangerous. Everyone involved knew that the colonel had backed down, not out of principle, but out of tactical calculation, and that he would eventually find ways to reassert control that wouldn't require public confrontations. Indeed, the colonel began implementing subtler forms of pressure. He separated known friends, reassigning them to different work crews. He reduced rations slightly, not enough to be obviously punitive, but enough to create constant low-level discomfort. He installed locks on the smokehouse, the tool sheds, the mill, anywhere people might gather unsupervised. He hired informants, offering small privileges to anyone who'd report on conversations or activities that suggested organized resistance. Divisions within the enslaved community were created by these tactics. Some people, frightened by the escalating tensions, withdrew from any activities that might be interpreted as resistant. Others became more committed to quiet defiance, developing increasingly sophisticated methods of communication and coordination that couldn't be easily traced or proven. Navigating between the main house and the quarters, Martha Clemens found herself in an unusual position to observe both sides of the deteriorating situation. She watched the colonel's paranoia grow, saw him reviewing patrol logs obsessively, noticed him starting awake at small noises. She also witnessed the nightly gatherings in the quarters where people shared information with practiced caution, passing messages through work songs whose meanings the overseers couldn't decode. In September, another letter arrived from Georgia, again bearing Jacob's distinctive mark. This one was even briefer. Colonel Harrington, you writing to Georgia plantations looking for me. You won't find me. I ain't where I was. We moved north and I ain't saying where, but I am writing because I heard about what happened with Daniel Hayes. I heard about 50 people standing together. I want you to know that ain't because of me. That is people deciding for themselves what they will and won't accept. I just showed them it was possible to decide. What happens next is on them and it's on you. You still got choices, Colonel. You can try to hold tighter. That won't work though, and deep down you know it. Or you can recognize that the whole system you're defending is already crumbling and you just can't see it yet because you're too close to it. I don't expect you to free nobody. I don't expect you to change what you've been taught your whole life. I just expect you to understand that everything that happened at your plantation this year is going to keep happening everywhere. People ain't going to just accept things no more. And no amount of overseers or locks or punishments can change that, because the thing that changed ain't outside where you can control it. It changed inside where you can't reach. Good luck, Colonel. You're going to need it. After reading this letter, the colonel did something witnesses found deeply unsettling. He laughed, not from amusement, but from what sounded like despair disguised as mockery. He showed the letter to no one, but his behavior afterward suggested it had affected him profoundly. He began spending hours alone in his study, reviewing plantation records from previous decades, as if searching for the moment when things had started to shift. He started questioning long-time overseers about their techniques, asking whether they'd noticed changes in how people responded to authority. He visited neighboring plantations seeking advice from other owners about maintaining discipline in what he described as changing circumstances. What he found disturbed him further. Similar patterns were being experienced by other plantations. Not as dramatic as Harrington's experiences, but subtle increases in resistance, more frequent escapes, small acts of defiance that added up to something larger. The consensus among planters was that Northern abolitionist propaganda was infecting the enslaved population, creating unrealistic expectations and undermining the natural order. But the colonel suspected something different. He'd read both of Jacob's letters carefully, and one phrase had lodged in his mind. You can't work a man who decided he ain't a thing no more. The problem wasn't external agitation. It was internal transformation, people reaching individual breaking points where compliance became psychologically impossible regardless of consequences. And if that was true, then no amount of security could solve the problem because the threat wasn't external enemies, but the fundamental humanity of the people whose humanity the system required denying. More than anything specific Jacob had done, this realization was what truly terrified the colonel. He began to understand that Jacob Terrell hadn't won through physical strength or clever escape planning. He'd won by simply deciding with absolute conviction that he was a person with the right to make decisions about his own life and then acting on that decision with complete commitment. That decision, witnessed by hundreds of people, had planted an idea that couldn't be uprooted. If Jacob could decide, so could they. In November 1857, the colonel made an extraordinary choice. He sold 75 people, nearly a third of Harrington's enslaved population, to plantations across 3 different states. He claimed he was liquidating excess assets due to cotton market fluctuations. But everyone understood the real motivation. He was breaking up the community that had witnessed Jacob's resistance and the subsequent events. Deliberately cruel in their targeting, the sales were. He separated families, split up known friends, sent individuals to plantations hundreds of miles apart where they'd have no existing connections or support networks. The goal was to scatter the memory of what had happened at Harrington to prevent the story from continuing to spread and inspire. But memories, as the colonel would learn, don't require physical proximity to survive. They travel through letters, through new arrivals at plantations who'd heard stories from those who'd been at Harrington, through the mysterious networks of communication that existed despite all efforts to suppress them. And amplified by each retelling, Jacob's story was becoming something larger than the man himself. It was becoming a parable about resistance, about the moment when a person decides that existence without dignity is no longer acceptable, about the power of witnessing someone refuse to be moved. These stories were carried with them by the people sold away from Harrington. And everywhere they went, those stories changed something small but significant in how people thought about their circumstances. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the implications of what began at Harrington Plantation in March 1856 were spreading far beyond one property in Madison County. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happened to both Jacob Terrell and Colonel Harrington in the months and years that followed. A cold that settled deep into Alabama's bones was brought by the winter of 1857 to 1858. Unusual for a region accustomed to mild seasons. Solid enough that people could walk across in places, the Tennessee River froze, something locals said they hadn't seen in 40 years. At Harrington Plantation, now operating with a reduced and deliberately fractured population, the cold seemed to mirror the atmosphere of suspicion and resentment that had replaced the property's former brutal efficiency. Over the 18 months since Jacob's resistance, Colonel Harrington had aged visibly. Neighbors commented on his graying hair, his distracted manner, his obsessive attention to security details that seemed disproportionate to actual threats. His daughter Caroline, now married and living in Charleston, visited for Christmas and was disturbed enough by her father's state to write her husband. "Papa is not well, though he denies it. He speaks constantly of the need for vigilance, starts at small noises, and has developed the habit of reviewing patrol reports at odd hours. He reminds me of a general convinced the enemy has infiltrated his lines, but unable to identify where the breach occurred." What Caroline didn't know was that her father had been receiving letters, not from Jacob Terrell, those had stopped after the September message, but from overseers at other plantations, some as far away as Mississippi and South Carolina, asking for details about the incident with the unusually strong man who resisted multiple overseers. Completely, the colonel's careful attempts to suppress the story had failed. A legend circulating through the network of plantations, slave quarters, and even some abolitionist publications in the North had become Jacob Terrell's resistance. Each retelling embellishing details, but maintaining the core narrative. One man had decided he wouldn't be moved, and he hadn't been. In February 1858, nearly 2 years after Jacob's departure, the colonel received a visitor that no one at the plantation expected. A Kentucky lawyer named Ambrose Stillwater representing a client he refused to identify. Stillwater requested a private meeting with the colonel, bringing with him a leather satchel that he guarded carefully. In the colonel's study, Stillwater laid out his purpose. His client, and he stressed that attorney-client privilege prevented him from revealing identity, wished to purchase detailed information about Jacob Terrell's background, training, physical capabilities, and the circumstances of his resistance and escape. The client was willing to pay substantially for this information, $500, an enormous sum for what amounted to historical data about someone who was legally still the colonel's property, though practically unrecoverable. The colonel asked why anyone would pay so much for such information. Stillwater's response was carefully phrased: "My client is interested in understanding the limits of human capability under extreme psychological pressure. The incident at your plantation appears to represent a case study of unusual interest." The colonel refused. He wanted no further documentation of what had happened, no more attention drawn to the events that had undermined his authority and scattered his workforce. He ordered Stillwater off his property, but Stillwater left behind a document that he claimed the colonel should review in the interest of understanding the full scope of what occurred. The document was a compilation of incident reports from 8 different plantations across 4 states spanning from March 1856 to January 1858. Each report described some form of organized resistance, work stoppages, mass refusals to accept punishment, coordinated escapes. And each incident could be traced through chains of communication the compilers had painstakingly reconstructed back to people who'd either been at Harrington Plantation or had direct contact with someone who'd been there. The pattern was undeniable. Jacob Terrell's act of individual resistance had inspired collective resistance. The story of one man standing immobile while 12 overseers failed to move him had become a catalyzing narrative that people used to reframe their understanding of what was possible. One report from a plantation in Mississippi was particularly striking. 23 people had simply stopped working in the middle of cotton-picking season, stood in the field, and refused all orders to resume. When the overseer approached with a whip, they'd formed a tight group. No one attacking, no one running, just standing together in a way that made any punishment impossible without dangerous escalation. The standoff had lasted 6 hours before the plantation owner conceded to a negotiation about working conditions. The report noted that several of the participants had been purchased from an Alabama estate that had liquidated assets the previous November, Harrington Plantation. Reading these reports in his study while sleet rattled the windows, the colonel experienced something close to an epiphany, though it was built from dread rather than enlightenment. Jacob Terrell hadn't just escaped. He demonstrated a principle that once witnessed and understood couldn't be forgotten, that the system's power derived not from its inherent strength but from the compliance of those it controlled, and that compliance was always conditional, always a choice, always capable of being withdrawn. The entire architecture of plantation society rested on the assumption that overwhelming force, when paired with systemic isolation and the destruction of individual dignity, could produce permanent submission. Jacob had proven that assumption false, not through violence or rebellion in the traditional sense, but through a simple absolute refusal to participate in his own oppression. And the proof had been witnessed by hundreds of people who couldn't unsee what they'd seen. The colonel understood now that selling away those witnesses had been exactly the wrong response. Instead of containing the story, he distributed it. The people he'd scattered had carried the memory like seeds, planting it everywhere they landed. In April 1858, the colonel made a decision that shocked his family and neighbors. He began the process of selling Harrington Plantation. The official explanation was that he intended to retire, that the burdens of management had become too demanding for a man approaching 60. But those close to him suspected the truth. He could no longer maintain the psychological fiction necessary to operate the plantation effectively. He'd seen too clearly the fragility of the system, the contingent nature of the control he believed was absolute. The sale was completed in September 1858. The new owner, a merchant from Mobile with no plantation experience, paid a price that reflected the property's fundamental assets, land, buildings, equipment, but not its reduced workforce or damaged reputation. Within 2 years, that owner would sell as well, unable to maintain profitability in an atmosphere where everyone who worked the land had heard stories about the men who couldn't be moved. But what happened to Jacob Terrell himself? The historical record here becomes fragmentary, based on unverified accounts and possible mythology that accumulated around his name. What can be established with reasonable confidence is this. In the summer of 1860, a Philadelphia abolitionist newspaper published a brief account by someone identified only as J.S., formerly of Virginia and Alabama. The account described a successful escape from enslavement, a 350-mile journey through hostile territory, and a reunion with a family that provided the strength necessary to reclaim my humanity in the face of a system designed to deny it. The account included one passage that seems unmistakably related to the Harrington plantation incident. I discovered that day that true resistance isn't violence or flight. It's the simple absolute insistence on your own human dignity in circumstances designed to strip that dignity away. I didn't fight those 12 men. I just decided they no longer had the authority to define what I was or where I could go. That decision, once made with total conviction, changes everything. Whether this J.S. was Jacob Terrell cannot be definitively proven. But the Philadelphia Quaker community that published the account was known to assist escaped slaves, particularly those who demonstrated the kind of extraordinary determination that Jacob's journey would have required. There are no death records, no capture reports, no further documented appearances of Jacob Terrell in any official capacity. For someone who'd been valuable property whose escape had caused such disruption, this absence of documentation is itself remarkable. It suggests either that Jacob successfully integrated into free black communities in the North where his past could be concealed, or that he died somewhere along the way and his body was never identified. But for the purposes of understanding the March 14, 1856 incident and its aftermath, Jacob Terrell's ultimate fate matters less than what he'd accomplished in that moment of resistance. He'd proved that the system's power was less absolute than it appeared, and he'd given hundreds of witnesses a new framework for understanding their own agency. The American Civil War, when it came just 3 years after Jacob Terrell's resistance, was fought over many issues: economics, states' rights, competing visions of national identity. But at its core was the question that Jacob's act had illuminated: could a system that required denying the humanity of millions of people survive their insistence on their own human dignity? The answer, written in blood across 4 years of conflict, was no. Colonel Marcus Harrington lived until 1871, surviving the war and emancipation, but never recovering from what he'd witnessed at his plantation in March 1856. His later correspondence, preserved in family papers, shows a man wrestling with profound guilt and confusion, unable to reconcile the person he believed himself to be with the system he'd maintained. In an 1869 letter to his daughter, he wrote, "I was not a cruel man, Caroline. Yet I participated in cruelty so systematic and complete that individual kindness became meaningless. The man Terrell taught me that, not through what he said, but through what he showed. He demonstrated that every person I owned had been making a choice every day, a choice to endure rather than resist, and that this choice was an expression of their humanity that existed despite everything I'd done to deny it." Harrington Plantation changed hands twice more before being subdivided into smaller farms in the 1880s. The cotton press area where Jacob had made his stand eventually became overgrown, then cleared for other purposes. Nothing physical remains today to mark where the confrontation occurred. But the story persisted. In the decades after the Civil War, as formerly enslaved people began documenting their experiences, multiple accounts mentioned hearing about the men who 12 overseers couldn't move during their time in bondage. The story had circulated through slave quarters across the South, always with the same core details: his size, his calm demeanor, his refusal to fight, the fact that he'd walked away while armed men watched, and most importantly, his statement, "I ain't here no more." Martha Clemens, who lived until 1938, told her granddaughter that Jacob Terrell's resistance had been the first time I ever saw white folks not know what to do. That changed something in how all of us thought about things. Not that we started thinking we could all do what Jacob did. Most of us couldn't, and most of us had reasons we couldn't leave even if we was able. But we started understanding that their power over us wasn't magic or natural or from God. It was just their power, and it only worked as long as we went along with it. Jacob showed us we was going along. We was choosing it even if all the choices was bad. That knowledge don't set you free by itself. But you can't get free without it. The question of whether Jacob Terrell actually possessed unusual physical strength, or whether his resistance represented something else entirely, extraordinary psychological determination that manifested as seeming physical invulnerability, remains impossible to answer definitively. Multiple witnesses confirmed the overseer's inability to restrain him. But witness accounts under conditions of fear and confusion are notoriously unreliable. What matters historically is not whether Jacob was objectively stronger than other men, but that his resistance demonstrated a principle about power, compliance, and human agency that resonated far beyond one plantation in Alabama. The system of American slavery, in retrospect, contained the seeds of its own destruction from the beginning. It required the continuous active participation of those it enslaved, which meant it depended on their ongoing choice to comply rather than face the consequences of resistance. As long as those consequences remained unbearable enough to enforce compliance, the system functioned. But once enough people, inspired by stories like Jacob's or driven by their own breaking points, decided that existence under the system was itself unbearable, no amount of force could maintain control. Jacob Terrell didn't end slavery. He didn't even significantly damage it. But he added one more story to the accumulating catalog of resistance that eventually made the system unsustainable. He demonstrated, in a moment witnessed by hundreds, that the power to say no, even when you're unarmed, even when you're facing overwhelming force, never entirely goes away as long as you're willing to accept the consequences. Whether he survived to see emancipation, whether he lived to raise his son in freedom, whether he ever knew how widely his story spread, these questions have no certain answers. The historical record goes silent on Jacob Terrell after 1860, which for an escaped slave might be the best possible outcome, successful enough in establishing a new life that his past ceased to follow him. Or perhaps the silence indicates a darker ending, one that countless others faced: capture, death, separation from the family he'd risked everything to reach. We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that on March 14, 1856, on a plantation in Madison County, Alabama, one man decided that his physical body was less important than his psychological freedom. And in making that decision with absolute commitment, he changed how hundreds of people understood their own circumstances. The story of that morning, 12 armed men failing to restrain one unarmed man who'd simply decided he couldn't be moved, became a parable about power, resistance, and the fundamental dignity that can't be stripped away as long as someone refuses to surrender it. This mystery shows us that sometimes the most powerful acts of resistance aren't violent uprisings or dramatic escapes, but simple refusals to participate in your own oppression. Refusals made with such complete conviction that they reveal the system's dependence on compliance. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Jacob Terrell possessed unusual physical strength, or was his resistance purely psychological, a determination so absolute it manifested as physical immovability? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more dark historical mysteries like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves exploring the forgotten moments that challenged America's most brutal systems. See you in the next video. End. Total approximately 58,000 characters.